So this is now recording. Welcome to the next podcast, the new podcast for our academic network on global therapeutic cultures. I'm very pleased today to be able to welcome Sarah White and Shreya Jha to this conversation. And well, first of all, I'd like to invite the two of you to briefly introduce yourselves, say who you are, what your research is about, where you work, and perhaps say a little bit about your intellectual biography at large.
Okay, so my name is Sarah White. I'm co-founder with Shreya of the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
This is a new venture. Up until August this year, I was Professor of International Development and Wellbeing at the University of Bath in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So I have left that post in order to work on translating our research on relational wellbeing into practice.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Shreya?
Yeah, sure. So Sarah's already said that we have co-founded a relational wellbeing collaborative to advance thinking on relational approaches to well-being. I have been a social development researcher and practitioner for about 20 years now, working both on the programmatic side as well as doing research. But this spans a number of different things in the social development area, but a lot on mental health and disability, from which also a lot of my thinking on relational well-being has developed.
Very well, thank you very much. So let's take a step back and go back to the beginning of your development as scholars and practitioners, and also previously as academics. How did you get into your work on the subject matter which you've just described? What interested you, what motivated you, and how did your careers develop from there?
Well, my career, I suppose, started with a PhD in social development. It was a village-based study, anthropology type study in Bangladesh, looking at women's lives. It was the 1980s, so that's what you did in the 1980s. And I think that orientation towards gender and broader issues of social inequality from that time has followed me throughout my work. So since then, I worked more on other issues within social development, such as race, participation, child rights, religion, even masculinity. So generally, issues about social difference and social inequalities, which came together then with an interest in well-being from the early 2000s. So at Bath, where I was working then, we had a large program called the Wellbeing in Developing Countries program on well-being, which was everybody who was involved in international development was involved in that program at the time. I was involved with the Bangladesh part of it and continued on the social development side. And really out of that, all of us were concerned to develop a more social approach to well-being rather than the very individualist approaches to well-being which tend to dominate. So that went on. I then got with Shreya an independent grant to develop further thinking on well-being and its relationship to poverty. And through that, we came to feel that rather than always being critical of other people and saying, well, it's not subjective well-being or we don't like individual approaches, we wanted to say something positive. And that's why we came up with the idea of relational well-being as something that we would like to advocate and move towards.
Very well, thank you. Shreya, would you like to add anything?
Sure. So as I already said, a lot of my work has been in mental health and disability. So around 2000 or so, I trained as a therapist, and I was working in a mental health agency here in Delhi. And what was I think distinct about the work that we did at the agency where I was working is this understanding that mental health is not just the absence or the presence of mental illnesses, but it's very much spans a spectrum of how people feel about themselves and how much that is rooted as well in their social context. So it isn't just a psychological state, but it's psychological state is intimately connected with everything else that's going on in their lives, including their social context and so much more. And it was very much about this understanding that, to understand mental health, it has to be linked with other aspects of people's lives. So what does it mean, if being a woman in a particular culture, what kind of effect does that have on a person's mental health? How does that locate the person and their mental health in that place? So it's very much this kind of understanding that we developed and that we worked with. So a lot of our work was in community settings to take account of people's contexts. So already very relational in that sense. And then around 2007 or so, I decided to pursue a master's, which, as it happened, was in well-being, and which I did at Bath. And that's where Sarah and I actually first met. And then from then onwards, happened to work together and have now worked together on this relational approach to well-being since that time. And as she's already said, a lot of our research was grounded very specifically in non-Western, non-metropolitan contexts, and very much to see, well, what does it mean? How does that develop a sort of distinct understanding of well-being, distinct from the kind of university-based studies that sort of typify, till then at least, a lot of the well-being research that has been going on, especially perhaps in in approaches to subjective well-being.
Yes. May I follow up a bit? A few questions came to my mind with regard to what you just explained. The first is, you use those two terms, mental health and well-being. How would you characterize, based on your own work, the relationship between those two terms, mental health and well-being?
Sure. I think that actually I would say that it's a slightly, my understanding is that it's a slightly blurred boundary. The mental, the psychological or mental health is very much constitutive of people's sense of well-being. But I don't know whether it's possible to say where one ends and the other starts. Well-being, however, has various aspects to it. So it is, how is mental health being affected? So as I already said earlier, mental health being grounded in a social context or linked with people's social identities, for instance, means that the sense of well-being is constituted through the interaction of these different aspects of people's lives, whether it's social, whether it's the material, all of those come together to generate a sense of well-being. I think that's what I would say.
Yes, and you explained, and I think this is a really very important point, that you endeavor to look at these issues from non-Western, non-metropolitan perspectives. How would you characterize the importance of these, adopting such a non-Western, non-metropolitan perspective?
I think what's really important in understanding well-being in this kind of context is that it recognizes the social to a far greater degree. It foregrounds the social, I would say, the social and material aspects of people's lives, rather than highlighting the psychological. I think that's what I would say. Sarah, would you like to add something to that?
I mean, I think you've put it really well. I mean, there were all kinds of challenges that we experienced, actually. We ended up thinking a lot more about methods of assessing well-being than we ever thought we would. So what we realized is that the ways in which well-being is thought about and the ways in which people are asked to speak about their work kind of chop their lives up into separate bits, and that just didn't work. When we were talking to people in these different kinds of contexts, they weren't used to, they hadn't been kind of schooled in how to present themselves as kind of psychological subjects. So what we moved to was to understand people as social subjects, and then ultimately actually as moral subjects, so that there was a much broader kind of engagement with their life experience that was required talking to them about well-being. And just kind of simply, you would ask them about one thing, perhaps, you know, how they're getting on with others in the family, and they'd ask about another, problems that they had with their livelihoods. So that kind of idea that you've got domains of well-being that are somehow separate from one another and can be dealt with separately, all of that really needed to be radically rethought when we were trying to understand from people's own perspectives what well-being looked like for them.
Which would in various ways indicate major steps beyond the conceptualization of mental health and responses to mental health and mental health crisis and mental unwell-being in Western scientific approaches, wouldn't it?
We think so.
Yes. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on this? What are the specific steps you've taken beyond these Western-centric or perhaps Eurocentric perspectives, and how on this basis would you characterize your approach to relational well-being?
So the relational well-being approach has a number of characteristics that are quite distinctive, I think. One is it is very much grounded in the relational, and that means obviously relationships between people, but it also means relationship between different kinds of factors. So we talk about the personal level. So clearly, in terms of well-being, it's important how people respond to situations they find themselves in, and there's variability at the personal level in terms of personal histories, temperaments, personalities, all of those kinds of issues, and those do need to be acknowledged. And we think a lot of social science has actually been rather poor in acknowledging those and sort of categorizing people and assuming that all women or all people of color or whatever will behave in a particular way. So that variability at personal level is very important, but then that needs to be linked with and the connection seen to the societal level. So that's about what policies are in place, it's about forms of social difference, it's about the ways in which commonality and difference is generated through societal structures and processes. And also what's really important within our context, within our approach, is to see that the societal and the personal are linked with the environmental. So we were working in rural contexts, people working the land, and it was very obvious in those kinds of contexts just how important the environmental context is to social and personal well-being. But of course, it's important for all of us. So part of what our approach seeks to do is to make manifest the relationships that are there but are often not seen between the personal, the societal, and the environmental, and to understand that it is the interplay between those different relations that produces or undermines well-being.
I think that this is a very clear account of what you mean by relational well-being, but it would nevertheless be interesting if perhaps both of you could say a little bit more about the work that you've done, both academic and non-academic, through which you've arrived at this conceptualization of relational well-being. So in other words, what I'm asking for are some concrete examples from your own professional and academic experience.
Would you like to start, Sarah?
No, you go.
Okay. Academic and non-academic work. So I think this conceptualization, as we've already said, it's based on 4 years of research in rural contexts in India and Zambia. And Sarah already brought this up, that we had to think a lot about methods. So we started, when we were doing that research, we did start with a domain-based approach to well-being. And what we discovered in the process of doing that, and the way that people, responded to questions, was that domain simply didn't work. So it established those kinds of interconnections that we've already spoken about. This is what then led us to the point of, saying that there needs to be a very radical shift in the way that we think about people's well-being. It is based a lot in that. So that was one sort of key place which led to the development of our approach. I think in my own case, a lot of my PhD, which I was doing side by side, also led me to think a lot about relationships. So my PhD, which was actually about agency, not about well-being, but linked, women's agency in some way with their well-being. Through that process, I was thinking about how agency actually arises in relation, not as belonging to an individual. So the action that might appear like agency may be done by the individual, but the context of that action is very relational. So it resides in relationships both with proximate others, but it also it's also affected by broader social relationships. So it is affected by people's location in social structures. And it's that interaction both between those more social relationships as well as more proximate personal relationships that is the relational context of agency. So there was a lot of thinking there that also led me to this place of, thinking in depth about relationships, not just at the personal level, but also in terms of how they interact with more social relationships. So I think that's my sort of academic journey.
Yes, if I can add to that. So an example would be the area where we were doing our research in India was the people were Adivasi people, so the people who were quite excluded socially. So in terms of understanding their well-being, you need to understand all of these interrelationships. So on the one hand, you need to understand what it means to be an Adivasi in the Indian context, and long histories of very problematic relationships with the rest of Indian society and also with the Indian state. This was very visible even in the way they behaved with us. So they were much more reserved, and it took a long time to build trust with them. It was very different actually to working in other parts of India or Bangladesh as we'd done previously. So it kind of that social history manifest in people's personal interactions. But if we want to understand the well-being of those people, we need to understand that societal context of those Adivasi people. Part of that societal context is also their relationship to the environment. So they are historically people who are forest dwellers, and their rights to the forest and to forest products are critical in terms of their livelihoods and also in terms of their identity. Those rights are formally established in Indian law, but actually very difficult to achieve in practice. So that interrelationship with the environment was very evident in terms of that kind of broader, in a way, the politics of it, but also more immediately, of course, in terms of, whether there was drought or there was good rains that year, and just the environment in terms of their agricultural livelihoods. But then you've also got variability at the personal level. So some of the people that we spoke to were, very clear that they were very critical, actually, of the way other Adivasis, not themselves, of course, behaved, and how they were drunk and how they were this and they were that, and were identifying themselves in a particular way and choosing to relate to their history in a particular way and seeking a different kind of future for their people as well as for themselves. Obviously, there's variability also between men and women and between people actually within the Adivasis of different people groups amongst them. So you could see that if we want to understand well-being, it is that interplay between the personal and variability of the personal level with that societal context, which also generates both commonality and difference, and then the environmental context and the relations with the environment, which of course are mediated also by the societal. So in many ways, the societal, the relational there is, it's the interrelationships that is what's productive or undermining of well-being.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think what you have just explained conveys a really clear sense of what you mean by relational well-being. Now, might I invite you to say a little bit about your current work and the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative and your activities and plans for it? That would be very interesting.
Shreya.
So, the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative is obviously meant to advance our relational approach to well-being, and to take it forward through practical models. So at the moment, we are working with philanthropy to develop an operational model of the relational approach to well-being, to integrate it through their programs, and yes, to basically see how one would put it into practice. They work with young people, so at the moment it's also, a lot of our work certainly has been, in relation to adults. So there is also, there also needs to be a reorientation in terms of thinking of young people's well-being and what is important for young people. So there's that kind of challenge. There is also the challenge of translating what till now for us has been a theoretical piece, a theoretical approach, into something that can be practiced. So it isn't just a straightforward translation from theory to practice. It's also then, it's also been to develop it intellectually in terms of, well, if this is what it means, if this is how the theory has evolved, how do we then practice in a way that reflects theory adequately? So, how do you take account of the context which would reflect relational thinking? What's the kind of analysis of the context that must precede how we put a program in place? What are the kind of understandings that we need to develop? So it is, developing that kind of orientation, not just for ourselves though, but for another agency. So there's also the translating of our theory to others, communicating it to others, for them to then actually put into practice. So yes, that's what we're doing right now.
Yes, I mean, I think it's actually been really a lot of fun, I would say, and also quite intellectually demanding. So that kind of question, well, so what does this mean we do? It's really quite a challenging one for people who are used to research and used to be able to have a lot of words to be able to kind of have quite a sort of nuanced approach. And so that's kind of, well, what do we do as a result of this question? And then, can you say that more simply so we can actually communicate it is another kind of challenge. But it's also, I think for the foundation we're working with, it's also seeing, well, how does the relational approach to well-being articulate them with other commitments they have, for example, to human and child rights? So it's bringing our approach together with, obviously, their existing commitments, which has also been, interesting and fun to do. So yeah, we've been enjoying ourselves.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. that's a very clear and interesting account of relational well-being and the work you are doing. And I think those are all the questions which I'd like to ask you today. Is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation?
I don't think so. It's been very nice to be able to talk with you.
So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. And well, bye-bye. Just
goodbye.
Bye.